Hello, this is Ed Mills. I'm with the Colorado Broadband Office. At the Colorado Broadband Office, we are concerned with all things broadband, and our team is here today. We have Sarah Smith, Megan Gernert, and Kay Hinsey. Unfortunately, the facilitator of the meeting today is Teresa Ferguson, and she has had to take some personal time to deal with a family matter. And so I am going to be facilitating the discussion, getting us going, but definitely our team members are here to support, and also a good buddy of mine, Nate Wolowitz, who is working on the Project 4 up in the Northwest Pod, will assist as well. We are getting some ambient noise in the background, so if you could mute, that would be fantastic, so we don't have to find out who's making all the noise out there. But anyway, we just want to let you know that the Lunch and Learn series is basically, it's just a service to our stakeholders in the state of Colorado to help you know what is available out there and to understand to a greater depth broadband and what is happening not only in our state but across the country and across the world. And so with that, we are very excited today to have to present Next Century Cities. And Next Century City is a nonprofit. It works with 209 members and municipalities across the country to support local level broadband access and adoption initiatives. While each of the broadband projects are unique, there are common threads that run through the stories of success. Next Century Cities created the Becoming Broadband Ready Toolkit as a one-stop resource for any local leader looking to connect residents to broadband. From staffing to permitting practices to financing models, Becoming Broadband Ready compiles the building blocks of a successful broadband project into an easy to use and impactful resource for any community. And I just wanted to say, we always have to give you just these caveats. The Colorado Broadband Office we don't officially promote or we have to kind of keep that, that approach that we want to present everything to it. So having anyone in the Lunch and Learn series is not necessarily an endorsement, but allowing you to get all the information that you can, and then to be able to use that information in whatever initiatives you have. So just a reminder too that we also have a website, and anything that you want to see that our office is doing, please go in there. It's at broadband.co.gov. And so let me introduce our speaker from Next Century Cities, and we'll get started. For those of you who hadn't heard yet and are just joining with us, our facilitator today, Teresa Ferguson on our team, was unable to attend. And in her absence, our entire team of Sarah Smith, Megan Gernert, Kay Hinsey, myself will be here to direct this conversation. Let me introduce our speaker, and Kat, you can go ahead and take that over anytime you want. Kat Blake is a senior program manager, Next Century Cities. At Next Century Cities, Kat supports local leaders with the tools and the information they need to bring fast, affordable, reliable broadband to their constituents. Specifically, she researches and advocates for effective broadband policy at all levels of government. She oversees member engagement strategy, coordinates the organizational operations. Kat has testified before municipal councils on the benefits of dig once policies and proactive small cell deployment ordinances, and recently helped lead the development of the Becoming Broadband Ready Toolkit, which she'll talk about today. This is a resource for local leaders to encourage broadband investment in their communities. Kat received a BA in Media Studies from the University of Virginia. And Kat, we are certainly very happy to have you here. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ed. Let me see. I think I can share my screen now. There we go. Great, I think we're all set. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Awesome.
Yep, we sure can.
Great. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Ed, and to the Colorado Broadband Office for having me, and to all of you for joining this call to learn a little bit more about Next Century Cities and the resources that we offer. I was lucky to be connected to the Colorado Broadband Office a couple months ago when I traveled to Breckenridge and participated in a public forum with Teresa Ferguson of the Colorado Broadband Office to talk about the town's new fiber network. And so very happy to be looped in with you all and all the great resources that you provide. As Ed mentioned, Next Century Cities, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization. And our members are municipal governments across the country. So we work specifically with local leaders on broadband access and adoption specifically. And we were founded in October of 2014 with 32 inaugural member communities. But now, just about 5 years later, we work with 209 communities across the country. And this includes 11 communities in Colorado. Do we happen to have any Next Century Cities members on the call with us today that we know of? All right, well, always happy to talk to new faces, and I'll mention a little bit at the end of this presentation about how you can become a member if your community is interested in doing so. Here's a map of our current members across the US. Our members are incredibly diverse. They're both large and small communities. They are urban and rural. And they also are diverse in their level of broadband access. So some of our communities are fully built out with broadband, whether that is through a municipal network or through an incumbent provider. And some of them are really just getting started. So the resources that we offer also span that gamut of different opportunities. I like to think of the work we do as kind of split into two main buckets, if you will. The first is that we advocate at the state and federal level for policies that are supportive of local broadband choice and universal access. And we really work to bring the voice of local governments into the state and national broadband policymaking conversations. And then the second piece of the work that we do is provide support directly to our member communities as they work to get their communities more connected to broadband. This varies depending on what the community needs from us. Some are more engaged than others, and some require different resources than others. But one example is that participation in the public forum with the town of Breckenridge. Next Century Cities traveled there to serve as a resource to talk about the benefits of public infrastructure ownership and why fiber matters and things like that. So we're really happy to provide that direct support. Some of the key policy issue areas we work on are protecting local authority for local governments in the broadband decision-making process, whether that's in regards to municipal broadband or small cell deployments in the public right-of-way. We encourage broadband infrastructure deployment broadly and support anti-monopoly and pro-competition policy in the broadband space. And increasingly, we're seeing more demand for resources around the deployment of small cells and also best practice permitting procedures more generally. And the way that we address some of these issues with our members is by providing policy and issue specific fact sheets. So maybe the FCC has come out with a specific proposal and it affects cities and their ability to deploy broadband. We'll create a really digestible 1 or 2 page fact sheet to make that easy for local leaders to engage with. We also write a weekly download email newsletter that is specific to members. And what we do there is provide an update of broadband policy updates from that week, either in Congress or at the Federal Communications Commission. We also use that email as a way to highlight member success stories. So we talk about the great work that our members are doing across the country. And part of the reason that's so important is because of that third bullet, which is community to community connections. One of the values of being a member with us is that you do have a network of 208 other member communities across the country that also view broadband access as a priority. And while all those members are different, there are a lot of shared best practices and advice that they can offer one another. So we act as a convener of those members. And most recently this year, we released our Becoming Broadband Ready Toolkit. And Ed gave a great overview of that, and I'll tee it up a little bit more. But before I dig into that, I'd love to quickly survey the audience. Whether you're on Zoom in the webinar, please feel free to use the chat, or if you're on the phone and you want to unmute yourself and chime in, I'd love to know what stakeholder groups are represented on the call and can help me tailor this a little bit better to everyone's interests and needs. So I'd love to hear from y'all if you represent a municipal government, if you're with a community anchor institution like a school or library or healthcare institution, if you're from the private sector, if you're an interested citizen or other. And I'm seeing some responses start to come in on the chat, but again, if you're on the phone, please feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. Looks like we have some emergency responders, some municipal government, some private sector. Awesome, so we have a really good mix here. And then another question I have is, in your community, whether you represent a municipal government or not, at what stage of broadband build out would you say your community is at? Would you say you have none or limited broadband access, that your community is in the research or the planning phase, that you're in a build out phase of a project, whether that is a municipal government led project or a private sector project? Do you have a complete build out, or maybe you're somewhere in between? Looks like we have some folks in the research and planning phase, numerous projects, all of the above. That's exciting. About 40% build out. Okay, great. Well, please feel free to continue to add in the chat. But this is really helpful, and it sounds like we really have a mix of folks from both of these questions. So I think that means we'll have a really great conversation, and I know that we will leave some time for questions at the end of this, but I'm also happy to take questions or even comments throughout. So if anyone wants to chime in, there's a lot of expertise in the audience here as well. All right, so now I'm going to dig into the Becoming Broadband Ready Toolkit, and I'm just giving this a minute to load here. All right, so hopefully everyone can see my screen here. As Ed mentioned, the Becoming Broadband Ready Toolkit was built out by Next Century Cities and created as a step-by-step guide for local leaders who are looking to increase investment in broadband in their communities and needed a place to start. It's also available as a PDF here, and if anyone wants to follow along online, I would encourage you to do so. And I'll say that while Next Century Cities' primary constituency is leaders in municipal government, and this toolkit was written for leaders in municipal government, I do think that it can be really helpful to almost any stakeholder. I'll talk a little bit later today about specific policies that can be implemented at the local level, but I'll say that even while those policies may be implemented by local leaders, I think that all stakeholders in the community ecosystem have a role to play advocating for good policies. So as much as Next Century Cities are cheerleaders of local broadband initiatives, you know, we're probably the biggest proponents of local broadband access. We're also the first ones to say that it is a lot of work for any community to take on a connectivity initiative. So we designed this as a way to start with the basics. And while no two projects are the same, so a community of a couple hundred people and a large urban center might have really different broadband plans for access. There are still a lot of common threads that run through stories of success. And that's one of the cool parts of working with 209 communities across the country, is you get that vantage point of being able to see the really creative connectivity solutions. But also you can start to see those common threads of, what are the themes that appear in successful projects again and again. So while these communities may be different, there are topics like establishing good local leadership, identifying goals for connectivity, how to evaluate different network models that really apply to any project. Something else I'd like to make clear before we dig into the content here is that this, in theory, is applicable to any broadband model. So this is not necessarily just a model for how to succeed at municipal broadband or at a public-private partnership. But really, this is intended to be a tool to help communities think through what that best model is for them and how they can implement it thoughtfully. So I'm hoping everyone can see my screen, and I'd like to just go over some of the elements of this toolkit before we really dive into the content here. Each of those common threads that I referenced, we have broken into a section that you can see in this sidebar here that will stay with you as you scroll throughout the entire toolkit. We talked a lot as a team at Next Century Cities about how to best organize these sections. And ultimately, the answer was that there were a lot of different ways to order these topics that made sense. So we chose an order that we thought worked well, with some groundwork considerations at the beginning and then getting into the more nuanced policy implementation at the end, and then just elected to make this as easy to navigate as we could so that folks could decide for themselves what the most applicable sections were. Another important feature that you'll see here is that there are these further reading lists at the end of every section or subsection. And the reason why we included these are because there's so many detailed resources and examples that we could have really extensively written about in this toolkit. But it was really important to us that we kept the text as digestible as possible. So we elected to keep the sections a little bit shorter and then include these opportunities for folks to dive deeper if they wanted to. Additionally, each section has a checklist here that you'll see. And these were included to make sure that this toolkit went beyond being a two-dimensional document and that it really could be used as a dynamic planning tool for communities. And you'll see in the side here that there's a checklist at the bottom, and this compiles the checklist from every section that's detailed in the toolkit into one big section, so you can really think through what your action steps are as a community. And below the checklist at the very end here, you will see a glossary of broadband terms. And this is actually a little bit of a newer addition to the toolkit, and we developed this in partnership with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance because we really want this to be accessible to anyone. You do not need to be an IT professional or a broadband professional to be able to use this toolkit and really take concrete next steps towards better broadband access for your community. And we did not want acronyms to be a barrier to entry to do that. And I think this is a good place for me to say that if you're looking through this, either during this webinar or later today or this week, and you think of a term that should be in here that's not, or even if you think of something that should be included in this toolkit that's not currently in there, I really, really encourage you to email me or someone else on the NCC team, and I'll share my email at the end. But you'll notice that we built this out as a website, and that was also really intentional. We didn't want this just to live as a PDF because the space is changing all the time, and communities are coming out with new initiatives and really creative solutions all the time, and the policy landscape changes. So we want this to be really dynamic, and really the lifeblood of this toolkit is not Next Century Cities, we're the convener of this, but it's the really good work that the communities are doing across the country. So if you have something you think would be valuable to add, I would be really interested to hear that. So with that long intro, I'm going to go up to the top here, and I would love to dig into a couple of the key sections here. And we're not going to be able to go through the entire toolkit because there's too much content for a webinar. But I would like to kind of at a high level, go over some of these sections. And as I mentioned before, if there are any questions throughout, please feel free to jump in. I'm really happy to take questions or comments throughout the webinar. So something you may notice about this toolkit is that the first several sections are actually not technology or broadband specific. And we decided to make the first section here about establishing leadership because we really see from our member communities again and again that for a project to be successful, you absolutely need strong leadership around broadband in your community. And we found that it is equally important to have the support of local officials in your local government and also of community members themselves. And I'll talk more about community support in the next section, but right now I want to talk about the importance of having a broadband champion within your local government. And the broadband champion can really be anyone. We have developed a broadband manager hiring guide to describe an ideal broadband champion, but this person might be the mayor, it might be someone on your city council, but this also might be someone with your municipal electric utility or in the public works department. And when we created this broadband manager hiring guide, we interviewed several broadband champions that we have worked with across the country. And we talked to them about what makes a good broadband champion. And we found overwhelmingly that technology skills were not prioritized. They were important, but folks said again and again, you know, anyone can learn tech skills, anyone can learn about network design. Not that it's easy, and I don't want to minimize that hard work, but it can be learned. But the really, really important stuff is the ability to see the big picture of a broadband initiative and to be able to communicate a vision of connectivity to a variety of stakeholders, the ability to be a flexible problem solver, and also to have a passion for improving your community. And the folks we interviewed said that that stuff's harder to teach. So if you can find someone within your local government who does have that passion and that long-term vision for connectivity, they can absolutely deep dive into this stuff and take on that role of broadband champion. And our interviewees also emphasized that having a repertoire of really bad internet jokes can also go a long way. And if you do explore that broadband manager hiring guide, which is down here, some of those are included at the bottom. And I'll also note that one issue we see in leadership again and again in our communities is that one of the sticking points is that oftentimes, you know, broadband projects take a long time. They take some time to get traction. It could be a couple of years before, you know, the shovel hits the dirt and a network is actually built. So it's really important that whoever that local leader is can see the vision of a project beyond what might be a term limit or a time in office. And so the next piece of leadership is, you know, there's that formal leadership in municipal government, but it's also extremely important to have leadership in your community and to have buy-in from your community. It's really hard for a project to succeed if it's just top down. You need strong community engagement around broadband. And, you know, one of the reasons why this is so critical is because, as I mentioned before, broadband initiatives at the local level are hard. You know, Next Century Cities will be the first to say that it's not an easy thing for a community to take on a large-scale connectivity initiative. But the payoff is worth it. And if the community has strong buy-in, they're going to be able to see that project through. And you want to make sure that you communicate really deeply with the community at large about what that long-term vision is, so that the enthusiasm can be maintained through what are inevitable bumps along the way. It's also interesting because every community project is unique and they're based on really specific community assets and strengths and weaknesses. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but every community is going to decide what they want to take on in terms of responsibility for a network and what they want to give up or delegate to partners. And that answer is going to be different for every community. So it's really important that you take the temperature of your community members to say, is there an appetite for, taking on debt for a municipal project? Or is there interest in the community being a service provider or not? And that can actually really make a difference in the long term to know where your community's at with that. I'm really excited to be talking to so many Colorado communities today, because you'll see if you dig into our toolkit that a lot of our examples and best practices come from Colorado communities, especially around building a community movement. Y'all seem to be really good at this. And two great examples of how this is done well is in Fort Collins, Colorado, when the community was considering building out a network. The city launched an interactive map here where citizens could drop a pin to indicate where they wanted to see better connectivity in their community. So that's one way to really engage the community in the process, and it will also help inform the technical specs of your project later on. Another great example is from Larimer County, Colorado, who issues a broadband newsletter regularly to share updates about broadband projects. And I love this one because I think this is a great lesson in that, it's important to have consistent communication about these projects. And you don't necessarily have to have big news in order to share an update with your community. Sometimes the update can just be that, we're still trucking along, we're working on the project. We don't necessarily have an update, but we're still excited about it. We hope you're still excited about it. And, please reach out to your city council if you have any questions or concern. And just that little stuff can really make a big difference. So I'm going to skip over identify goals for now, just because I think this one's a little bit easier to dive into and it's a little bit more community specific. And I think that the next section of evaluating your current circumstance really ties in closely to community engagement. You want to be able to talk to your community about what services are actually available to people and how they are experienced, so that you can set those goals for what you want better connectivity to look like. And once you've decided what those goals are and where you want to go as a community in terms of connectivity, and once you've acknowledged that that will probably be a moving target throughout the process, you then need to evaluate where it is that you're starting from. And this is where that deep community engagement really pays off, because you're going to want to measure demand and take the temperature for connectivity. And also, you're going to want to take some time to map your community assets. A lot of communities have a surprising amount of physical assets already in the community that are often publicly owned, such as conduit or dark fiber, but they don't always know exactly where those assets are. And taking the time to accurately map those assets can really benefit a project in the long run, because you don't want to be in a situation in which you are duplicating efforts or spending extra money to double up on a resource that's already there. And the city of Boston created this publicly available map that displays the location of shadow conduit throughout the city. And this is just one example of what you can do to just really make sure you have that full picture before you dive into a large scale project. This is also an important section or an important phase of the project where it's really important to talk to other partners in the region. And I'm really excited to hear that Project Thor is represented on the call today. And I don't know if anyone from your group wants to jump in and offer any thoughts on this, but it's really important to talk to other regional stakeholders, whether those are states, county governments, emergency responders, to make sure that you're not duplicating efforts without knowing it, and also so you can talk about how to work together. So you want to reach out to folks and find out what connectivity efforts might exist nearby, and how that can inform your work. So next, I'm going to dig into, this is a little bit more of a meaty section, talking about what policies and procedures can support investment at the local level. So the policies that are outlined here are a couple examples of policies that can be implemented at a city, town, or county level that can encourage broadband investment, whether by the city or by a private sector provider or another entity. And I'm going to start by talking about Dig Once policy. So when fiber or other wired broadband infrastructure is deployed, it can either be buried or strung on poles. And Dig Once policies address burying fiber. So this is a policy that encourages the placement of fiber or conduit in the ground anytime that the road is dug up for a public works project. And because the construction costs actually represent the most expensive line item in a broadband deployment budget, as opposed to the fiber and the conduit itself, Dig Once policies are a really common sense method of reducing costs of communications infrastructure deployment. Studies have shown that proactive placement of conduit can be estimated to save between $30,000 and $100,000 per mile compared to the cost of revisiting streets and digging them up again. And the consulting firm CTC Technology and Energy estimated that the cost of a provider pulling fiber into existing conduit is just 10% the cost of underground construction without the conduit. So this can be a really good way to reduce those capital costs of deployment. And what we've done and what we've tried to do throughout the toolkit, and I think that this policy section is a good example of that broadly, is link directly to example ordinances wherever we can, because we want someone to be able to look at this and say, hey, I think it would make a lot of sense to implement a Dig Once policy in my community. And you can find some example text right here within the toolkit. We've also included some other resources here, that CTC report and others, also in part with the intention of allowing folks to use these as resources to advocate for these policies with their city council or with other stakeholders. So overall, Dig Once as a policy lowers that cost of deployment and also promotes competition by breaking down a huge barrier of entry for new providers. And it eventually can create a more competitive marketplace that hopefully will result in more choices in providers and higher quality of service and lower prices for consumers. And it can also reduce the strain on a community just by minimizing the traffic and safety and noise concerns that come with just constant construction work. Some states have also implemented Dig Once policies at that level, including Arizona, Minnesota, and Utah. And municipalities like San Francisco and Boston and Santa Monica have adopted this at the local level as well. One Touch Make Ready is kind of a sister policy to Dig Once in that it also streamlines the deployment of new infrastructure in order to lower costs and encourage investment. And just as Dig Once applies to buried fiber or infrastructure, One Touch Make Ready applies to the aerial deployment of fiber on poles. And to understand the potential impact of One Touch Make Ready, it's important to understand the existing or default pole attachment procedure when it comes to communications infrastructure. So typically, in order for a new provider to attach wires to a pole, each owner of the wires that are already attached to that pole must be asked separately to assess and move their wires if necessary in order to make room for that new attacher. And this process is called Make Ready. So incumbent providers that are already attached to the poles don't necessarily have incentive to move quickly. In fact, they might be incentivized to move particularly slowly. So that process can typically be very long and capital intensive for that new entrant who does have to bear the cost of all of that Make Ready work. And in addition, the ongoing work creates those same, noise and traffic and temporary service interruption concerns that I referenced before. So what One Touch Make Ready does is it designates a single contractor or a group of contractors that all of the existing pole owners agree upon to conduct all of that Make Ready work at once. So this results in faster and safer work, and again, that decreased capital cost and lower barriers to entry. States like Maine have implemented this at the state level, and Vermont is in the process of considering this at the state level as well. So overall, both Dig Once and One Touch Make Ready are good examples of common sense policies that can really help incentivize deployment of broadband infrastructure. On a slightly different note, we've also seen from our member communities that it can be really valuable to have a template lease agreement in place. So if your community does have either fiber assets or conduit assets or other infrastructure that might be of interest to providers who are hoping to use that to deploy broadband in your community, it can be extremely helpful to have a template lease agreement that's already in place because communities have said that it's easy to be caught flat-footed when you're approached by other entities who want to use those assets, but you don't have a fee structure in place or any sort of lease agreements. So we recommend this as a best practice to have something in place, and we've linked a couple of examples right there in the toolkit so that it can be as easy as possible for other communities to implement something like this. We also are seeing more and more these days, especially with the buzz around 5G, which I'm happy to answer questions about or discuss later if folks are interested, and the deployment of small cells in communities, that having simplified permitting practices can really encourage vendor investment. So, when we're thinking about partnerships with the private sector, it really is a two-way street, and the more simplified and streamlined your permitting practices can be, and that you can design those with your community interests in mind, you will attract more private sector partners. And this is true for any sort of permitting, but I think a great example is small cells, and I love to talk about the city of Huntington Beach, California's process that they put in place for pre-approved designs for small cells in their community. So what they did was they worked with private sector providers to develop a set of pre-approved small cell designs. And we've actually linked them right here. And so what happens is if you're a provider and you want to deploy small cells in the public right of way in Huntington Beach, and you approach the community and your designs match these pre-approved designs, you then get to enjoy an expedited permitting process. And those were developed in collaboration between the city and private providers. The city of Riverside, California also is a great example of a city simplifying permitting in their community. They created a one-stop permitting shop to address complaints that they had been getting that their permitting process was confusing. So what they did was they located all 7 departments that addressed permitting in the city, and they put them in one floor of City Hall. So now if you are looking to get a permit in the city, you can visit that one place in City Hall. It looks really fun and inviting, and all of your information is in one place. And again, this isn't necessarily a broadband specific best practice, but it can really incentivize deployment. There are a couple other sections in here about, creating clear review processes for special districts that might be in your community, and also how to leverage your municipal assets, and how to encourage competition in multi-dwelling units. I'm not sure how many communities represented on this webinar have large apartment building populations in their communities, but there's an issue that we see again and again in communities where competition can actually be stifled in these multi-dwelling units or apartment buildings, because landlords will sometimes strike exclusivity agreements with providers. So even though there might technically be multiple providers offering service in a neighborhood or in your community, the residents of that apartment building will only have access to one provider. So obviously this is not ideal for competition or consumers, but local governments can address this at the local level. And the city of San Francisco did pass a local statute in 2016 that essentially banned these exclusivity agreements. And this is a really straightforward way for local governments to encourage broadband competition in their communities. And local governments are actually pretty uniquely positioned to be able to do this. The Federal Communications Commission has technically addressed this in the past, although their policies have not really been enforced or seen much material difference in communities. So this is a great place for local governments to dig in and really make a difference in competition. I'm just going to give a really quick overview of these next couple of sections because I want to leave time for questions, and I also know this is a lot of dense material and I've been talking at y'all for a while, but we also emphasize the importance of digital inclusion in a community. It's one thing to deploy a broadband network or to work with a partner to deploy a broadband network, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the digital divide is closed or that everyone has the same opportunities. So we offer some recommendations here and also link to several different digital inclusion plans that have been implemented at the city level to give ideas about how local governments can address this. We also have a whole section here about legislative and regulatory barriers that communities should consider when evaluating what kind of broadband projects they're going to pursue. This is important because depending on what state you live in, you might not be legally allowed as a community to pursue the same project that someone in a neighboring state did. Everyone on this webinar, I believe, is represented in the state of Colorado, so it's a little bit more straightforward, but there's still several considerations beyond municipal broadband, but there are also state regulations when it comes to small cell deployments and the authority that cities have there, and also pole attachment procedures, which vary from state to state. So we provide some resources here about how you can learn more about what those specific policies are in your state. And then we also offer some examples of how you can work around barriers and think creatively about a city project, even if there are barriers in place. The city of Lincoln, Nebraska provides a great example of this. The state of Nebraska has a state law that bans municipalities from leasing out city-owned fiber. So the city of Lincoln instead built a really extensive conduit network throughout their city and then leased access to the conduit network. And, as we talked about earlier in the section about dig once, having that conduit in the ground provides a really big incentive for providers to deploy fiber. And so that was a creative way that the city thought about what barriers were in place, but what they could do within those barriers to come up with a solution to improve access in their community. We also have a whole section here about different network models. So we talk a little bit about municipal networks. We talk about open access networks, which have been getting more and more attention. We talk about public-private partnerships, which obviously can't be described in just one paragraph. We talk about the value of institutional networks. So if your community is building out infrastructure that will connect your municipal buildings and your anchor institutions, how can you leverage that to increase connectivity in your community more broadly? And we also talk about electric co-ops, which again are starting to receive more and more attention, and also working with incumbent providers. And we also set up this section with the intention of helping communities think through what options best for them. I really encourage folks who are in this stage of evaluating a network model to read more here about Westminster and Ting's story. Westminster is a community in Maryland who works with Ting to create a public-private partnership for a fiber network in their community. And that's just one model that works really well for them, but Dr. Robert Wack, who is the former city council president in Westminster, does a really good job of talking about how his community thought through their priorities. They were really comfortable building out infrastructure, but they didn't want to operate the network. And that give and take is going to be a little bit different in every community, but it's important to think through, what those priorities are so that you can explore these models. We also lay out a couple different financing options here. We talk about different financing models, but we also outline the different grant and loan opportunities that are available at the federal level, both through the Department of Agriculture and the Federal Communications Commission, and include some information here about other financing opportunities. We also linked to information about state programs, though we didn't have the capacity to detail every broadband state program in the country. But since we're lucky to be on this call with the Colorado Broadband Office, I'm sure you all know who to reach out to if you have questions about your state's program. And lastly, we include information about how to be a clear collaborator. And again, this is something that just rings true no matter what your community's model or connectivity initiative is. No community goes at this alone. You're going to be working with partners both in your community and beyond. And it's really important to have a clear idea of your community's priorities, as I mentioned before. And it can also make a really big difference to designate a point person. It can be as simple as, knowing that your partners know who to reach out to with questions. As I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of these seem like non-broadband specific related recommendations, but it's what we see makes a big difference in facilitating these partnerships and these projects across the country. And lastly, we offer some recommendations here about how to think about success for your project. So any good project should be able to reflect on itself and think about if you've been successful, and it can be helpful to set some of those goals for success at the beginning of the project so that you can measure your outcomes. And this is going to be different for everyone, but we offer some example parameters here of how you can think through success of a broadband project. So before we go to questions, I'd just like to offer this URL about how you can become a member of Next Century Cities. I know this was a lot of information and a really quick run through of some of those high level ideas of the Becoming Broadband Ready toolkit. I hope that it helped some of you think through what those next steps are, and if you're thinking about connectivity in your community but don't know where to start. I hope this got the gears turning, and also, you know, shared a resource with you that's full of other resources that go much beyond Next Century Cities and point to the good work that other communities have done that can be used as a pathway for cities across the country and towns and counties as well. So I'd love to talk to any of you about becoming a member. You can find more info on our website. Also check our site because your community might be a member already. And if that's true, but you're not involved, I would love to reach out to you to talk about how you can be more involved in Next Century Cities. I hope if our toolkit showed anything, it's that our strength is really in our membership. And we'd love to have anyone on this call, you know, as a part of our network. And here is my contact information. So I'll leave this up on the screen for now, but Ed, I'm not sure if you'd like to facilitate questions or if we can just open this up if anyone has questions for now.
Sure, we'll just we'll open it up. I noticed many of you were very conscientious, and we thank you in putting yourself on mute. So if you do have a question for Kat, please take yourself off mute and go ahead and ask your questions. Also, if you're having any issues, you can go ahead and put a question in the Zoom, and we can get your question out there. So let's go ahead and open it up. What questions you have for Kat? And by the way, Kat, excellent. You made my job as facilitator extremely simple today. So thank you so much for that. Any questions for Kat?
Glad to hear that.
Hi, Kat. It's Kay Henze. Thank you so much. As you mentioned, there's so much information here. I'm just curious, how long has the toolkit been available, and what are the sections that you're seeing, I guess, most commonly used?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we launched this toolkit in January of this year, so it's almost a year old. You know, I'm not sure if I know which sections we're seeing used the most, but I will say, to sort of answer a different question, you know, we're seeing communities come to us looking for new sections about things like disaster response and network security and data privacy and security. So I know that doesn't exactly answer your question, but I actually don't have too much information on which are used the most.
Great, thank you.
Other questions for Kat?
Hi, Kat. This is Megan with the Colorado Broadband Office.
Hi, Megan.
So I'm wondering if you have any tips for if a community is struggling to find a willing and able local leader. I know you had a whole section in the toolkit about identifying that person, but what if you just can't find anyone, but you still have that kind of community need and desire to do something?
Yeah, absolutely. So this isn't always possible for a community, but you can consider hiring into a new position. And we, in part, designed that anatomy of a broadband manager guide that I mentioned as a hiring guide for communities. And one of the questions that we asked our interviewees was, you know, if you're not hiring from within your organization, where would you recommend looking for applicants for this position? So that's certainly an option, although I know that that's not always in a community's budget to hire into a new position. But I would, other than that, I would encourage folks to, you know, expand the footprint of where you're looking. As I mentioned, you know, the community broadband champion isn't always someone that's in that city council or economic development office, but it could be someone who maybe is laying low within your city government and isn't even necessarily in a leadership position. But I would just encourage folks to, talk about this issue with as many people and as many stakeholder groups and city departments as possible, and eventually see what sticks.
Hey, Kat, this is Sarah from the Colorado Broadband Office. I have one question for you as well. I noticed on your website that you had the section that had the contents, and you mentioned finding financial assistance.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious if you talk about any sort of federal funding broadband infrastructure programs on there, or if you can just talk briefly about the type of federal assistance you discussed. Or, I'm sorry, the financial assistance you discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. So hopefully everyone can still see my screen. In the Explore Financing Options section, we do detail all of the federal grant and loan programs that are available to fund broadband infrastructure projects. So the majority, if not all of these, are grouped within either the Department of Agriculture's Rural Utility Service or within the Federal Communications Commission. And for each of these, we have linked to that grant program and provided a brief blurb about what the grant program is intended to do. So here you can see we outline each of the Federal Communication Commission's programs and talk about how the E-rate program is specifically designed to offset the cost for schools and libraries to get connected. The high cost program funds carriers who provide service in more rural areas. And then we talk about, the different USDA programs that are available, including the newer or newest Reconnect program that's offered and was actually being developed as we were developing this toolkit. And so we were able to update the website, luckily, as those eligibility requirements were made concrete. So for each of these, you can click on the page and it'll take you directly to the grant or loan program where you can learn more about the application itself. And also, Next Century City staff aren't necessarily like experts on every single small part of this toolkit, but I will say that, if you're a community that's looking through this and you want more information about any of these programs or any other part of the toolkit, really, even if we can't answer the question, we can hopefully connect you to someone else who can. So another thing we did in here, for example, is included the USDA tool that helps you identify the field representative that addresses your region. So you can reach out to them for more information, but you can also reach out to us and we can try to help folks get connected to people in those offices to learn more about finance options.
Hey, Kat, this is Megan again.
Hey, Megan.
In regards to the federal funding, do you have members who have gone after some of those funds and been awarded and potentially have success stories from those? Because a lot of them are, some of them are geared more towards the carriers and providers rather than the local governments. So I'm just wondering if you have some of those success stories in your members.
Yeah, so that's a great question and a great point. The unfortunate reality is that we actually have some members who have been awarded these grants and loans and have actually had to return the money because that burden of administering the grant and managing that grant was so great on the community that it was going to cost them more in staff to manage the grant than they were actually getting from it. And it's not necessarily a best practice, but it's to your point that a lot of these programs aren't designed with community leaders in mind. And to go on a bit of a tangent, I think that's one reason why it's really important for local leaders to be engaged in these conversations. The FCC is in the process of of developing their Rural Digital Opportunity Fund right now. And that's exactly the kind of thing, we want to keep in mind as new programs are being developed, that they need to be more accessible to communities. To your question, we definitely do have communities that have successfully leveraged these grants. Increasingly, we're seeing more and more co-ops in communities be awarded money through the rural utility service programs. I don't have a list offhand right now, but if there's a way for me to send you all at the Colorado Broadband Office information after this call that you could share with attendees, I'd be happy to do that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kat, for helping us understand more about Next Century Cities. I'm getting a lot of comments from folks, and it was great information. It was very informative, and we really appreciate the work that you do, especially with the Becoming Broadband Ready toolkit. And I think we've learned so much that it's probably going to spawn a lot of questions, and we may need to follow up with you maybe later on in 2020. And thank you so much for coming and spending some time with us today.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me, to the Colorado Broadband Office and Ed and all the attendees on the line. My contact info is on here. For those of you who are on the phone, my email address is cblake, so C for cat, and then Blake, B-L-A-K-E, at nextcenturycities.org, and you can find me through our website as well. I would love to chat with anyone who wants more info or has any questions.
Excellent. And we want to remind you that we do have this, we have recorded this session today. And after we give Kat a couple, 3 days to give us any feedback about any edits that we need to make, we will make that available to you. And you can always, any of our lunch and learns, you can find them on our website. And it's video on demand, so you can go in and listen to it. If you have any questions that our team can field, please don't hesitate to reach out to us as well. And thank you also to the Colorado Broadband team to help us fill in the gaps today and help mitigate the fact that Teresa wasn't here to facilitate. We all here at the Colorado Broadband Office hope that you have a safe and a warm day. Thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you in 2020. And we will have a whole set of new lunch and learns. So thank you for your attendance, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks all. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.